The world stands at a crossroads, where politics, power, and chaos collide, and never before has humanity felt the trembling uncertainty of global order quite like today. The shocking meltdown of Donald Trump, unfolding in fiery speeches, angry declarations, and furious accusations, has become more than just a political drama. It is a storm whose ripples shake the foundations of diplomacy and security across the globe. Nations watch with dread, adversaries seize opportunity, and allies question commitments, for the rage of one man has ignited fears of a world teetering on the brink of catastrophe. What begins as a personal outburst threatens to become a crisis for all of humanity, and the question remains, are we witnessing the early tremors of a global disaster, or a warning that can still steer us away from the abyss? In the halls of American politics, drama and chaos have always been recurring elements, but never has the world appeared so perilously close to the edge of global catastrophe as it does now with Donald Trump's latest and most explosive meltdown, a spectacle that is at once deeply personal, intensely political, and dangerously international in its ripple effects. For when a man who once held the most powerful office in the world begins unraveling in full view of allies, adversaries, and the global public, the implications stretch far beyond partisan squabbles and reach into the very fabric of global security, diplomacy, and the fragile peace that separates order from disaster. Trump's outbursts, delivered in a whirlwind of angry speeches, late-night rants, and furious declarations on social media, have escalated into something more volatile than mere political theater, for they reveal not only the state of his own psyche under pressure but also the vulnerabilities of a world that still takes cues, whether directly or indirectly, from his every move. The picture is surreal and almost cinematic, a former commander-in-chief raging about betrayal, conspiracies, stolen victories, and phantom enemies both foreign and domestic, while journalists scramble to record his words, his loyalists cheer him on as though every outburst were divine truth, and his critics warn with growing urgency that these meltdowns are not harmless spectacles but dangerous sparks capable of igniting real-world consequences. What makes this moment uniquely perilous is that Trump, unlike countless other political figures who have ranted and raved on the stage of history, once commanded nuclear codes, reshaped global alliances with impulsive decrees, and elevated his personal grievances into matters of national policy, meaning that every meltdown he displays is not merely the venting of a man under stress but the reawakening of anxieties about what might happen if such behavior once again intersects with the levers of state power. Nations across the globe, from NATO allies in Europe to rivals in Asia, are not watching his tirades with detached amusement but with mounting dread, for they understand that the stability of international order depends as much on perception as on reality, and Trump's meltdowns are feeding the perception that America is fractured, volatile, and incapable of steady leadership at the very moment when the world faces crises on multiple fronts: Russia's aggression in Ukraine, China's rising assertiveness in the Pacific, tensions in the Middle East, and the ever-present specter of cyber warfare and nuclear proliferation. The sense of inevitability creeps into conversations among diplomats, scholars, and even military planners, as if history itself is whispering warnings drawn from the tragedies of the past, when great wars erupted not from careful planning but from pride, bluster, miscommunication, and leaders who underestimated the destructive power of their own words. In Trump's current state, legal troubles and political challenges have cornered him, amplifying his sense of grievance and fueling his fury, and yet that fury cannot be contained within America's borders. It reverberates globally, shaking the confidence of allies, emboldening adversaries, and leaving ordinary citizens to wonder if they are once again living through the early tremors of a geopolitical earthquake. His critics describe him as more unhinged than ever, a man driven less by vision than by vengeance, less by strategy than by emotion, and yet his supporters, often blind to the dangers, frame his meltdowns as authenticity, as proof that he is willing to shout truths that others fear to speak, and therein lies the peril, for in politics perception can be as powerful as policy, and a perception of chaos at the heart of America is enough to destabilize entire regions. In the echoes of his voice, raised in anger against enemies seen and unseen, the world hears more than rhetoric. It hears uncertainty, it hears volatility, it hears the possibility that the carefully maintained equilibrium of international relations could shatter, leaving in its place the kind of instability that has historically led not to peace but to war. The unsettling reality is that Trump's meltdown is not a private implosion hidden away in obscurity but a global tremor broadcast to every corner of the planet, magnified by cameras, amplified by media, dissected by analysts, and ultimately interpreted by generals, presidents, and prime ministers who must decide whether they are witnessing the harmless bluster of a disgraced politician or the early signals of a larger and more dangerous unraveling of the world order. The spiral of danger deepens. When we examine how Trump's words, no matter how impulsive or emotionally charged, ripple outward into tangible consequences that shape decisions, strategies, and perceptions far beyond America's borders, for the world has learned that in the age of instant communication and globalized politics, the line between rhetoric and reality is perilously thin, and what may appear as a rant to some can be interpreted as a signal by others. Each time Trump lashes out against NATO, describing allies as freeloaders, weaklings, or ingrates, the Kremlin hears encouragement, a green light to push boundaries in Ukraine or test NATO's eastern flank, calculating that internal divisions in the alliance could reduce the likelihood of a unified response. When he attacks Europe for failing to spend enough on defense, leaders in Poland, Lithuania, and the Baltic states scramble to accelerate military spending and regional coordination, fearing that an America swayed by Trump's worldview might one day refuse to come to their defense under Article 5, leaving them exposed to Russian aggression. When he rages about China, promising tariffs, punishment, and confrontation, Beijing does not dismiss it as campaign bluster but reads it as a justification to accelerate its military buildup and prepare for a future confrontation over Taiwan, where one miscalculated move could drag multiple powers into open war. His tirades against South Korea, Japan, and other Asian allies during his presidency left scars that linger today, and every new meltdown rekindles those anxieties, reminding these nations that the American security umbrella they rely on is fragile, conditional, and potentially subject to the whims of one man. His constant accusations of betrayal by his own institutions, his insistence that the military, intelligence agencies, and courts are corrupt, project an image of a divided America, one less capable of unified leadership in the event of a crisis, and adversaries like Iran, North Korea, and terrorist groups seize upon these fissures, testing missile launches, escalating cyber attacks, and probing vulnerabilities in regions where American focus seems blurred. The danger is not hypothetical, it is structural, for in international relations perception shapes behavior, and Trump's meltdowns create the perception that America is distracted, erratic, and divided, an impression that can embolden aggressors to act where they might otherwise hesitate. Even within the United States, his meltdowns are not dismissed as harmless theatrics but provoke fears among military officials, diplomats, and policymakers who know that every outburst, every threat, every casual mention of retribution is read by foreign capitals as a potential clue to future policy. Analysts point out that his unpredictability, once marketed as strength, has now become a liability, because allies cannot count on consistency and adversaries cannot predict boundaries, leaving both sides on edge and more prone to miscalculation. Consider the fragile situation in the Middle East, where American power has long served as a balancing factor. Trump's angry denunciations of Iran and his withdrawal from key agreements destabilized the region once before, and his continued meltdowns about betrayal and vengeance suggest a future in which diplomacy may collapse altogether, creating fertile ground for regional wars that could easily spiral into global conflict. The same dynamic plays out in cyber warfare, where his tendency to accuse enemies in broad strokes and without evidence prompts states like Russia, China, and Iran to intensify their covert operations, calculating that chaos within America makes retaliation less likely or less coordinated. The meltdown narrative, therefore, is not confined to television screens or campaign rallies. It becomes a real-time risk assessment, a factor that generals consider in their war games, that diplomats weigh in their negotiations, that financial markets digest when they respond to geopolitical volatility. His defenders argue that his harsh words keep adversaries off balance, but history has shown that uncertainty can be as dangerous as weakness, for adversaries, unsure of where the red lines truly lie, may cross them inadvertently, triggering confrontations neither side intended. The world teeters on this knife edge of perception and miscalculation, and every time Trump raises his voice in fury, the echoes travel not just across American airwaves but into the halls of power in Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, and Pyongyang, where leaders, suspicious and ambitious, are waiting for precisely such moments of instability to seize opportunities. The irony is stark. Trump believes his meltdowns prove strength and authenticity, but in practice they often project vulnerability, broadcasting to the world that America's leadership is fragile, its politics fractured, and its commitments uncertain, and it is within that uncertainty that the seeds of world war are sown. For history teaches us that wars rarely begin with deliberate grand designs but with chain reactions of missteps, misinterpretations, and misplaced confidence. Thus, Trump's meltdowns are not merely political dramas for domestic consumption, they are, in effect, global tremors, subtle but powerful forces that shift the tectonic plates of international relations closer to collision, leaving the question not if but when a spark ignites the volatile mix of rivalries, weapons, and ambitions simmering across the globe. And yet perhaps the most unsettling dimension of this unfolding crisis is not merely Trump's behavior itself but the way the world responds to it. For international politics is not a vacuum in which words disappear after they are spoken but a living system where every statement, gesture, or display of weakness is interpreted, amplified, and redefined by other actors on the global stage, each with their own ambitions, fears, and strategies, and Trump's meltdowns have become raw material for both allies and adversaries to manipulate, exploit, or brace against. In Moscow, state-controlled media gleefully amplifies his tirades, framing them as proof that the United States is fractured beyond repair and unfit to lead the Western alliance, a narrative that strengthens Vladimir Putin's hand domestically and emboldens him internationally, for if America is distracted and consumed by internal chaos, then Russia has greater freedom to act in Ukraine, Georgia, or even in destabilizing NATO's periphery. In Beijing, Chinese strategists study Trump's unpredictability not as a weakness but as a variable to be gamed, calculating how his erratic approach to alliances and trade can be used to justify China's own assertiveness in the South China Sea or its accelerating plans for Taiwan, presenting themselves as the stable alternative to America's chaos even as they quietly prepare for confrontation. In Europe, the response is torn between alarm and pragmatism. Leaders in Germany, France, and Brussels speak cautiously, warning of the dangers of Trump's rhetoric, while at the same time working behind the scenes to shore up defenses, increase military cooperation, and reduce reliance on Washington, for they know that if his influence grows again, NATO's unity could be tested to the breaking point. Eastern European nations, closer to Russia's shadow, react with even greater urgency, accelerating arms purchases, fortifying borders, and preparing contingency plans in case America falters or withdraws, for they cannot afford to take the gamble that Trump's America will honor its commitments when push comes to shove. In the Middle East, where American influence has long been decisive, the picture is even more complex. Iran interprets his meltdowns as signs that U.S. policy is unstable and may swing toward escalation without warning, prompting it to expand its nuclear program while deepening ties with Russia and China. Turkey, ever opportunistic, maneuvers to present itself as an independent regional power, leveraging Washington's unpredictability to pursue its own ambitions in Syria, Libya, and beyond. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states hedge their bets by strengthening economic and security ties with China, wary that Trump's America could once again abandon or turn against them in a fit of rage. In Israel, the uncertainty is palpable, as leaders weigh whether Trump's fiery rhetoric signals future support or future abandonment, and in Palestinian territories, militant groups calculate that chaos in America may translate into opportunities on the ground. This global theater of reactions demonstrates the peril of the moment. Trump's meltdowns are not isolated outbursts but catalysts, reshaping the strategies of nations who are already locked in tense rivalries, and each shift in strategy adds fuel to the larger fire of instability. Even non-state actors, from cyber-criminal networks to terrorist organizations, sense opportunity in the disorder, calculating that a distracted America, consumed with internal division and led by a figure prone to emotional eruptions, will have less capacity to respond effectively to asymmetric threats, and thus they move more boldly, exploiting the cracks in the system. Meanwhile, international institutions like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and the G20 find themselves paralyzed, unable to reconcile the competing narratives of allies and adversaries, and increasingly marginalized in a world where Trump's voice, amplified through media, distorts the agenda. The threat of world war grows not because a single speech or meltdown can directly cause armies to march, but because each outburst chips away at trust, erodes alliances, hardens rivalries, and normalizes instability, creating an environment in which one misstep, one clash at sea, one border skirmish, or one cyber attack could spiral beyond control. What makes this especially dangerous is that history shows us wars rarely begin with a deliberate decision to launch them but rather emerge from accumulations of misjudgments, each side believing it can act without provoking the other into full-scale retaliation, until the chain of events becomes unstoppable. Trump's meltdowns, broadcast in real time and interpreted by actors with competing agendas, increase the likelihood of just such misjudgments, because his unpredictability is contagious. It encourages allies to act defensively, adversaries to act aggressively, and institutions to act cautiously, a combustible mix in a world already armed to the teeth and riddled with unresolved tensions. The global response to his rage, then, is not passive observation but active recalibration, and in this recalibration lies the shadow of disaster, for the more the world adjusts to instability, the more normalized instability becomes. And the closer humanity edges toward a future where the next war is not an accident of fate but the logical outcome of a system that allowed chaos to masquerade as leadership. As the world holds its breath in this atmosphere thick with uncertainty, one cannot escape the realization that what is unfolding is far greater than the meltdown of a single man, for Trump's outbursts are not isolated tempests but catalysts that reveal just how fragile our systems of diplomacy, security, and global cooperation truly are, and how easily the fate of nations can be swayed by the rage, fear, and ego of a leader unwilling to accept limits. His fury may appear personal, driven by vendettas against political rivals, judges, journalists, and institutions that he claims betrayed him, yet every eruption becomes part of a larger chorus echoing across the globe, interpreted by allies and adversaries alike as a window into America's soul. For ordinary people, watching from afar, the spectacle is at once surreal and terrifying. A man who once sat at the pinnacle of power, who commanded armies and nuclear arsenals, now descending into rants about conspiracies and enemies, while commentators warn that such instability is not harmless entertainment but a harbinger of crises that could touch every corner of the globe. The fear that hangs in the air is not that Trump alone will press a button or issue an order, but that his meltdowns will weaken the ties that hold back chaos, that they will fracture alliances, embolden aggressors, and erode the trust necessary to prevent escalation in regions already trembling on the edge of conflict. History has taught humanity hard lessons about the cost of misjudged words and unchecked ambition, from the blunders that led to the First World War to the brinkmanship of the Cold War, and yet in this moment, it seems those lessons are being forgotten, as once again pride, anger, and mistrust overshadow dialogue, restraint, and wisdom. The sobering reality is that the institutions meant to guard against such dangers are themselves weakened, their credibility battered by years of populist rhetoric and rising authoritarianism, and in that vacuum, Trump's voice looms louder than it should, setting the tone for an era where volatility is mistaken for strength. Allies who once looked to Washington for stability now hedge their bets, building their own defenses and seeking alternative partnerships, while adversaries push the boundaries of what is permissible, probing for weaknesses in a world distracted by spectacle. The looming shadow of world war is not conjured out of thin air but emerges from these cracks, the fraying of trust, the erosion of alliances, the hardening of rivalries, and Trump's meltdown is the accelerant that makes each of those cracks wider, deeper, and more dangerous. Yet even in this darkness, there remains a flicker of hope, for history also shows us that crises, when confronted with courage and clarity, can lead to renewal rather than ruin. The question now is whether leaders, institutions, and ordinary citizens will recognize the peril in time, whether they will choose to resist the temptation of division and confrontation and instead demand a return to reason, diplomacy, and restraint. If Trump's meltdown is to mean anything beyond the chaos of the present moment, it must serve as a warning, a reminder that peace cannot depend on the stability of a single man, that the security of nations must be built on stronger foundations than the whims of populist fury, and that humanity, in its quest for survival, must rise above the anger of individuals and embrace the collective wisdom of history. The ending we deserve is not one written in fire, blood, and destruction but one forged in humility, compromise, and unity, for only then can the shadow of war be dispelled. And so, as the world watches this dangerous spectacle unfold, the choice remains before us: to allow the meltdown of one man to dictate the destiny of billions, or to stand firm in the belief that humanity's future must not be decided by chaos but by courage, not by rage but by reason, not by the threat of war but by the pursuit of peace, for in that choice lies the true ending, one that ensures the world does not descend into disaster, but rises instead toward the fragile, precious hope of lasting peace. As the dust settles on this dangerous chapter, one truth becomes clear: the meltdown of a single leader cannot be allowed to dictate the destiny of billions. The threats of war, the fractures of alliances, and the erosion of trust all remind us how fragile peace truly is, and how easily it can be lost when anger and ego overshadow reason and diplomacy. But history has shown that humanity can rise from the edge of chaos if it chooses unity over division, wisdom over rage, and peace over war. The future is unwritten, and though the shadows of conflict loom large, the choice remains in our hands. Either the world succumbs to the fire of confrontation, or it embraces the courage to preserve peace, for in that choice lies not only the ending of this story, but the beginning of humanity's next chapter.